this project would not be possible without them. So without the help and the guidance of these people, it just wouldn't happen. So I want to give them all a special shout out. So many thanks to my fellow student doctors, Kylie Limbach and Kirk Lester, as well as the KCU faculty on this project, which include Dr. Rogers, Dr. Kramer, and of course, Dr. Dennis, who has been very instrumental in helping me throughout this entire project. So I will not spend the time reading this abstract of the project aloud for you, but I have included it here at the beginning of the presentation just for completeness sake. This is the 228-word abstract that I submitted to the KCU Research Symposium for my iPoster. And I have also included the KCU IRB number for the study at the bottom of this slide. So to go ahead and jump into the content of this study, the important experience of the gross anatomy lab cannot be overstated as it pertains to medical education as a whole. There are many skills to be learned from the time spent in lab, such as the valuable time spent understanding the ins and outs of the human body through both dissection and prosection. Seeing the anatomy in person is also critical for orientation's sake, and students are able to hone in on their ability to work as effective members of a team during dissection, as well as further develop their empathy for future patients through dissection of their, quote, first patient. Time spent dissecting and learning in the lab also helps teach first-year medical students very important time management skills as they balance the requirements and the expectations of first year, which is sometimes a big hurdle for students to jump. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic created many challenges globally in almost every aspect of life, but especially in the realm of anatomy education as we focus on here, and in particular with gross anatomy. Traditionally, this first year anatomy laboratory component has been given both in person and on campus to help students develop the skill sets that I previously mentioned. And KCU in particular has used student-led dissection as the means to help educate our first-year students during these gross anatomy laboratory sessions. So during the 2020 to 2021 academic year, the COVID-19 pandemic brought on many restrictions and a lot of changes, which we are all familiar with and none of us were equipped for. But these restrictions were to help mitigate the spread of this virus. One of these changes was the pivot of in-person and on-campus labs to be delivered solely in an online remote format. So during this particular academic year, classes and labs were impacted differently depending on their place within the calendar year. So during the fall semester, which was August to December of 2020, the gross anatomy labs were delivered entirely remotely and students had no access to labs. So students were not allowed in lab to study their prosection or to dissect or to attend any anatomy tutoring, so no access at all. And the courses that were affected by this change were musculoskeletal, which is abbreviated MSK, and neuroendocrine, which I usually just refer to as neuro. During the spring semester, however, which was January to March of 2021, the gross anatomy labs were instead delivered in person and on campus. And again, the KCU labs in particular had a focus on the student-led cadaver dissection. And the courses involved in this were gastrointestinal genital urinary, or GIGU, and cardiopulmonary renal, or CPR. So this table here outlines the 4 courses that contain the anatomy laboratory components that were provided for the first-year students at KCU. As well as the format in which they were delivered depending on the time of year. So for MSK and Neuro, which were given in the fall of 2020, the lab format was entirely remote, but the assessment format was as well remote. So everything in the fall semester was completely online and remote with no access to campus. For GIGU and CPR, which were given in spring of 2021, the lab format changed and is now on campus. But the remote assessment format that was implemented in the fall semester did not change. So even though the lab format changed from fall to spring semester, the assessment format remained remote and online for the entirety of the year. The supplemental resources that were provided for the first year students, whether lab was on campus or remote, remain the same throughout the entire academic year. And these included pre-labs, which were made and provided by KCU faculty, VHD, which stands for Virtual Human Dissector, and 4D Anatomy. And the latter two supplemental resources are the anatomical software that was provided by KCU for the first year students. So as I stated on the previous slide, the same supplemental resources were given to the students throughout the entirety of this academic year. Students were provided with various virtual anatomy software in order to supplement their anatomical learning of gross anatomy. And the main two anatomy software that were given to the first year students at KCU were VH Dissector, which is on the left here, and it's a virtual interactive dissector and cross-sectional anatomy, and 4D Anatomy, which was a software that was cloud-based virtual cadavers. These are both interactive anatomy learning tools that included labeled cadaveric images. So one of the main differences between these two online resources was that the 4D Anatomy was really a resource where you could type in something that you wanted to see and it would show you various aspects of it. And the VH Dissector, something that made it unique was that it contained like stepwise modules of how to do dissections and what they included. And then at the end of each module, they actually included quizzes. So students were able to quiz themselves on how much they had learned while using that software. So students were able to use these two platforms in order to enhance their learning, again, whether the lab was online or in person. And one of the reasons that I have really enjoyed being involved in this study is because during my second year at KCU, I was selected to be an anatomy tutor. And I think this gives me a unique outlook on this particular topic, and it made me especially curious about the outcomes of this study. So like the first year students, my ability to be in lab in order to tutor on anatomy was restricted due to COVID. So I also had to use this supplemental anatomy software in order to tutor my students in their weekly Zoom sessions. So I was using the software the same as the first year students, and I was finding many of the same strengths and limitations as we progressed through the academic year. So there have been previous studies conducted that focus on the faculty-led changes in gross anatomy labs and assessments due to COVID-19, but our study brings a different perspective of student perceptions of remote versus on-campus labs. And to our knowledge, this qualitative aspect of the medical student's point of view has been lacking thus far in the literature as it relates to this topic. To evaluate this change in the anatomy lab delivery format, students in one single cohort were provided with supplemental questions that surrounded their experience with both formats of labs, so both remote and on campus. And as many of us are familiar with, whether we have filled it out ourselves or been on the receiving end, at the end of each course, students are provided with a course evaluation to provide feedback on that particular course. And these supplemental questions that were created were incorporated into the standard course evaluations that the students received. So we predicted that students would prefer the traditional hands-on in-person format of anatomy labs compared to the remote sessions, and therefore they would rate the on-campus anatomy labs more favorably compared to the remote anatomy labs. So here is a study design timeline to kind of help describe and illustrate the flow of the project thus far. So in the fall of 2020, the gross anatomy labs, again, were remote, but they had synchronous delivery of material and the students were provided with that previously described anatomy software. In the spring of 2021, the gross anatomy labs were now on campus, but again, it was the same synchronous delivery of material with the same anatomy software provided. By the summer of 2021, the course evaluations that contained those supplemental questions were requested. And by fall of 2021, the quantitative and qualitative analyses of those supplemental questions were performed. And these analyses then allowed us to compare the student perspectives of both formats of the gross anatomy labs. So for the quantitative aspect of the study, the students were provided with Likert scale questions. And Likert scale is really just a scale that's commonly used to help measure attitudes and perceptions and values. And the final question given to the students changed slightly, just depending on if it was answered in the fall semester with remote labs, or if it was answered in the spring semester with the on-campus labs. So the questions included: 1, VHD and 4D anatomy were effective tools for learning cadaver-based anatomy. 2, pre-lab teaching modules were helpful for directing my studies prior to lab sessions. And 3, instructional online pro-section reviews were helpful in learning gross anatomy. The final question was: cadaver dissection in the laboratory either would enhance or enhanced my understanding of gross anatomy, again, depending on if this question was provided in the course evaluations for the fall semester or the spring. Likert scale validity was analyzed using Chromebox Alpha, which this just measures internal consistency or reliability. And the responses were then compared among the remote and the on-campus formats using chi-square. So here are the results of that quantitative analysis. So portions of this table are highlighted in 2 different shades of purple to help draw your attention just to the overall trends of the student responses. So the numerical trends indicate that students overall did not like the provided software, but they did find that the faculty pro-section reviews were helpful. You can see on this table that the dark purple highlight for the prompt regarding the helpfulness and effectiveness of the anatomy software is either in the strongly disagree or disagree category. And this just emphasizes the students' dislike of the software options that were provided to them. If you look at the dark purple highlight in the bottom prompt about the faculty-led pro-sections being helpful for their learning of gross anatomy, the majority of students responded with either agree or strongly agree. There was not a significant difference between the remote and on-campus responses regarding the anatomy software or the faculty pro-section, but there was regarding the pre-lab teaching modules between the remote and on-campus responses. Then here are the results for the final Likert scale question, which again, this was the question that changed slightly between fall semester and spring semester, which just reflects the change between remote lab and on-campus lab. And again, this highlighted section within the table indicates the trends of student responses. So most student respondents, regardless of fall or spring semester, either agreed or strongly agreed that in-person cadaver dissection either would enhance or did enhance their understanding of gross anatomy. And I don't think this result is especially shocking or surprising, just given the multitude of benefits that in-person lab provides for students as they are learning gross anatomy potentially for the first time. It's surprising the number of students who matriculate into medical school never having had an anatomy class, and especially a lot of students never having been in a cadaver lab before. Also, as someone who has the frame of reference of many years spent learning and dissecting in various cadaver labs through my undergraduate and graduate and now medical education versus having to tutor from the anatomy software during my second year, I can definitely understand why these students both agreed and strongly agreed that being in person in the anatomy lab and learning primarily from the student-led cadaver dissection would and does enhance the understanding of the subject matter. So for the qualitative aspect of this study, there were 2 open-ended questions that were provided for the students in their course evaluation. And these were, number 1, describe any drawbacks you identified in utilizing virtual anatomy software. And number 2, what other virtual or online resources did you use to supplement your learning? These responses were coded via thematic coding. The fall semester open-ended questions were coded by a set of 2 researchers, which were Dr. Dennis and student Dr. Lester. And the spring semester open-ended questions were coded by a different set of 2 researchers, which was student Dr. Limbach and myself. And the codes that we generated for these responses were either one word or a short phrase, basically to help just summarize the overall gist of the student responses. And then each set of researchers coded individually and then got together to compare their own assessments of these responses and then come to an agreement about the coding. So here are the results for the open-ended questions for the remote fall semester. So overall, these narrative responses reported many drawbacks in the software. They indicated that it lacked spatial relationships, which made orientation difficult, which you can see in this pink color here, that the software was difficult to use in the red color. And they also indicated that there was just a preference for having on-campus labs, which you can see in the light purple color here. There was a small subset of students who found the quizzes within VHD helpful, which is in the dark purple. And then another subset of students who just reported that they did not use the provided anatomy software at all, which is in the blue color at the top. And in terms for what other virtual or online resources they use to supplement their learning, the responses really varied. So students reported using the Complete Anatomy app, which was actually the #1 most frequently reported outside resource used in the fall semester. And you can see that in the dark red color here. And that was followed by a variety of different resources, including YouTube, the Essential Anatomy app, and the University of Michigan Blue Link. And some students, which you can see in the dark purple here, again reported using no extra resources at all. And then a small group of first-year students actually responded that they primarily relied on the resources that were provided to them by their KCU tutors and fellows as their supplemental study, which you can see in the top kind of teal color. So then here are the results for the open-ended question for the on-campus spring semester. So again, overall, these narrative responses also indicated that there were many, many drawbacks in using the virtual anatomy software that was provided to them. So students mostly responded that the software was poorly designed and unnecessary for their studying. There was actually a subset of students who again expressed a preference for the on-campus lab instead of the remote options. And then interestingly enough, there was a group of students who reported that the software was generally helpful or that they did not have any complaints. And actually, when you dive into this category, a lot of those responses from the students really highlighted the usefulness of the quizzes that were within that VH Dissector anatomy software. So the quizzes were really the saving grace of the software that they were provided. For each category in this prompt of drawbacks in utilizing virtual anatomy software, we have subcategories to help describe them a bit further. So the category of bad design was named as such for the following reasons. Students responded that the software was difficult to use and not user-friendly. It was not detailed enough or was poorly defined. There was no surrounding context provided for the images. The images that were provided were bad, and students called the software, quote, clunky, and claimed that it was lacking information and missing structures that were vital to their learning because those structures were included on their KCU lab practical structure list, but they could not find them on the software. The software was deemed unnecessary due to the following student responses. Students just did not use the software at all. They called it a waste of time and a waste of their tuition money. They responded that virtual anatomy was, quote, not helpful. It was useless, awful, and they just plain did not like it. A lot of the students in this category, especially in the waste of time subcategory, they really just said that the learning curve was too steep to use the software. And by the time they could figure out what they were doing and how to use it in the best way possible, the payoff of what the software provided just was not worth it in the end. So they just called it a waste of time. So for other online resources, our spring semester categories were actually coded just slightly differently from the fall. The fall semester coders identified specific resources that were used, while the spring semester coders, we placed those specific resources into much broader categories. But this discrepancy will absolutely be remedied before we finish completing the manuscript. So again, students mostly reported using other online resources. They used apps, atlases, and mainly they used Dr. Ollinger's Human Anatomy Atlas, as well as KCU provided resources, which mainly included the study slides that were provided by their KCU anatomy tutors. And again, some students responded that they used no additional resources to help supplement their learning for gross anatomy. The top resources that students used in the spring semester with their on-campus anatomy labs were Dr. Ollinger's Human Anatomy Atlas, which was of course categorized into atlases, Ackland's Video Atlas and the University of Michigan Blue Link, which were both categorized into online resources, and then tutoring resources, which were categorized into KCU resources. And it could be that students really relied more on Dr. Ollinger's Atlas over other resources in the spring semester because these students were now back in person and on campus and working directly with him in the anatomy lab. So instead of learning everything virtually and kind of feeling like they were on their own and using things like the Complete Anatomy app or the Essential Anatomy app, were back in person and with Dr. Olinger, and they probably figured that using his atlas was the best way to supplement their learning while they were learning on campus. So overall, our results for the quantitative analysis portion of this study showed the following for both the remote and the on-campus student responses. The provided anatomy software was overall just ineffective for learning gross anatomy. The pre-lab modules that were provided by the KCU faculty were helpful, and the faculty-led pro-section reviews were very helpful. And again, students either agreed or strongly agreed that cadaveric dissection either would enhance or did enhance the learning of gross anatomy, again, depending on the semester. So for the qualitative portion of this study, remote student responses from the fall showed that the provided virtual anatomy software was overall just difficult to use and lacked the spatial relationships that were critical for its use and understanding. Students overall preferred the dissection experience over the remote options. And again, they really enjoyed using those quizzes that were provided in the VHD anatomy software. And for outside resources, students used the University of Michigan Blue Link, YouTube, and the apps Complete Anatomy and Essential Anatomy. And then for the on-campus responses, it showed that the virtual anatomy software, again, was just unnecessary, but some students did find it helpful or had no complaints. And again, that can mostly be attributed to the responses in favor of the quizzes provided by the VH dissector. Again, students indicated a preference for the in-person lab as opposed to the remote experience. And students reported using Dr. Olinger's Human Anatomy Atlas, the Ackland Video Atlas, and also images from the University of Michigan Blue Link. So this study highlights and brings a unique insight into the student perspectives of the remote versus on-campus gross anatomy lab formats that were brought upon in response to the changes from the COVID-19 pandemic. So overall, students responded that the provided virtual anatomy software was difficult to use, it was hard to orient, and just at the end of the day was unnecessary for studying and learning gross anatomy in their first year. Students also indicated a preference for the on-campus lab experience over the remote options that were provided. And compared to the provided anatomy software that KCU gave them, students really preferred and used other virtual studying options. And those included a variety of online resources. Again, University of Michigan, YouTube, and Ackland's were some of the highest. Different apps, which again, Complete Anatomy, Essential Anatomy, and Anki was another one that students really used. Atlases, mainly Olinger's Human Anatomy Atlas, but also some students responding that they use Netters, and then resources that were provided by the KCU tutors and the fellows. So this study aids our institution in providing feedback from students who actually utilize the virtual anatomy software and how remote gross anatomy lab experiences can be further improved upon in the future. So what's next with this project? So we are currently in the process of writing the manuscript. So student Dr. Limbach and myself are dividing up the introduction and the discussion, and then Doctors Dennis, Creamer, and Rogers are helping to solidify the methods and the results. And so together, when that is all put together, our goal is to have this manuscript written up and finalized by the end of May of this year. So in about a month or so, which is coming up very close. And there are several possible journals that we could try to submit this to once we have completed it. And those include the Medical Science Educator, the Journal of Osteopathic Medicine, and Medical Teacher. And then here are the references that I used in this presentation. And thank you for listening and attending. Are there any questions?
Plenty of time for questions. Dr. J, I saw your hand go up.
Thank you, Dr. Steininger. Alyssa, I really enjoyed that presentation. I thank you very much for that. And I do recall looking at your poster at Research Day. Having said that, I got a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
First and foremost was, were there any surprises to you as you looked at this in hindsight under the circumstances how this was implemented, knowing that COVID was rampant and vaccines were in the process? Not everybody had gotten them, but most had, but in numbers were going up. So that's my first comment to you is, was there anything that surprised you from looking at this in hindsight?
Honestly, I don't really think that there was much that surprised me in terms of the student responses that I saw. Just again, with my experience as an anatomy tutor, and I had to use the virtual anatomy software just like the first year students did. And going through their responses, they basically articulated everything that I had been telling my friends and fellow tutors last year about what I thought the drawbacks were with the software. And it didn't surprise me that they would rather be on campus and in person, because in my opinion, again, that software that was provided just was not the same experience for learning anatomy like it is in person.
Okay, all right, so that's not a surprise. Then put yourself in managerial or teaching positions to having to make decisions. What alternative would you offer under that environment that would, in your opinion, have been different? Or what else could have been done to help teach? What else should we have implemented?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Honestly, given what we knew at the time and what was available to us, I honestly think that KCU did the best they could by providing those two different anatomy softwares. I'd never used them before and I'd never heard of them before, but I think it was really just an experiment of trial and error to see if the students did learn from them and if they did like them. Because obviously we were in kind of a crunch of a time frame. So sending out maybe some polls to students to see what they would prefer or what resources they already liked, we probably didn't have the time frame to do that. So I'm not sure what the managerial standpoint could have done instead. I think they did the best with the information that they had at the time.
Okay. My last question to you is, with the virtual usage, was it the quality of the image versus that spot that you should be seeing or that landmark you should be seeing just wasn't there? Was it the resolution, or was it just, hey, this is not adequate enough?
I think it depended on which software you're talking about. I think the VHD software, in my opinion, was far superior to the 4D anatomy software. And even with the VH dissector, you were just missing context, but the image quality was great. With the 4D anatomy software, I think the real problem was that, like I said, you could search structures in that software and it would show you different angles and different viewpoints of those. But the main problem I saw with that was that when it showed you a structure, it highlighted that structure in a lime green color. So you couldn't really see the structure through the highlight that the software was trying to show you.
Okay. And then my last question, and I'll sign off, is what would you do different?
With this study or with?
No, in implementation under circumstances, and maybe even with this study in hindsight.
In hindsight, I think that maybe KCU could have sent something out at the end of the fall semester and just gauged what the students' perceptions were of the software before they implemented them again for the spring semester. Because I think they could have even asked the anatomy tutors who had to rely heavily on these softwares and ask, what our opinions were and what we thought could have been done differently, and then maybe tried to pivot before the spring semester.
Okay, I do recall that the incidence of infection of COVID from a surveillance perspective was relatively low among our students, but I don't remember what the percentage was in the fall and what compared to the spring. Have you looked at that? Do you have any recall of what it was back then?
No, I do not have those numbers and I have not looked into those, but that would be a good thing to look into to see if we could have potentially started letting students on campus in small numbers to help them back into the lab. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I thought you did a very, very good job here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions.
Student Dr. Tong.
Hi, yes. I wanted to thank Alyssa so much for this presentation. I am currently a second year and I was part of this virtual cadaver learning cohort during my first year. And I, like a lot of the students in the survey responses, also expressed skepticism towards the software. And to answer Dr. J's question about what could have been done, I had submitted several open doors on this topic, but I really think, like Alyssa had mentioned, maybe having a small group, like prosected, pre-dissected sort of just walkthrough. Like I know Dr. Olinger had made videos of what seemed to be like a lab review where he would focus on the section we were learning at the time and just go through all the structures, and maybe instead of having that as a video recording, we could all just go in a small group and crowd around the cadaver. I think maybe the fellows could do that too, maybe, since there were multiple, and the fellows had also hosted exam reviews prior to our practicals, which were super, super helpful. But unfortunately, it was just however many fellows per campus in the cadaver lab at the time. And I think if there had been a live audience, students would be really receptive towards that. I think it would only further enhance our learning, although we did find those reviews very, very helpful.
Student Dr. Schiller.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alyssa. It was an excellent presentation and very informative about some of the changes we've made throughout the pandemic and the student perspectives of those. I think something we can agree on as fellows is there's a learning curve to gross anatomy, and anyone who's taken a gross anatomy course. It takes some time to learn the difference between an artery, vein, and a nerve, and orient yourself in an actual cadaver. And I would assume there's the same kind of learning curve with any virtual anatomy software. So I'm wondering, in the student responses, was there any place where a student could put how many hours they put into these virtual reality things, or if you think some type of set curriculum with the virtual tools, like how we have a set curriculum with the cadavers, would have allowed students to get over that learning curve and use these virtual tools more to their capabilities?
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure if there was any sort of spot on the student response form that allowed them to say maybe how much effort they put into trying to learn the software. But I do know that in those pre-labs that were made by the faculty, they did have hyperlinks to the software. So as you went through the pre-labs, it did lead you to the various parts of the software that could help guide you along with the pre-labs. But I'm not sure about exactly like how many hours per se that people tried to use it in particular with the responses.
Student Dr. Fagnelli.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first of them being, you had mentioned when discussing that there was a small set of people who had indicated that they actually did like that online virtual dissector software. And you listed that one of the reasons that were provided in those responses was the quiz function. And I was just wondering if there was any other feature that was like listed in those positive comments, or whether the quiz was the only thing that came across in those comments.
Really specifically to the anatomy software, instead of like the broad comment of virtual anatomy was helpful to me. It was really just the quizzes within the virtual human dissector that people found helpful. There was nothing positive that anyone said about the 4D anatomy.
Okay. And then my second question was, so have you considered or given any thought to like a first year implementation bias, in the sense that maybe some of these problems that students felt with the virtual dissection software compared to being in a lab were contributed due to the fact that this is the first time our school has had to implement these changes, and whether, like, if this was, I know some programs use online dissection software a lot more frequently. And so maybe if there was more consistency and like more knowledge in the people administering the curriculum with the software, that it would have been a better experience for those first year students.
Yeah, that is absolutely a possibility. I think the more that you're familiar with the software and you can help students learn it, the happier they'll be with it. I do think that there's just some subsets of students that are just not going to be happy with it at the end of the day, regardless, because what they signed up for when coming to medical school was that in-person cadaveric experience. And using that online platform is just, I mean, we know as fellows, that's just not the same sort of situation whatsoever. So I think there probably could have been more done with the software, but again, like as the perspective of a tutor, I did not find any value in the 4D anatomy, but I did use the VH quizzes in my tutoring sessions. So I would say there were probably pros and cons, but I'm not sure how to overcome that hurdle without actually trying them and using them.
Thanks.
Student Dr. Hankey.
Good job, Alyssa. My question, or I guess first, I know there's like some medical schools where it's like even outside of COVID, it's just completely virtual. Like they never have a dissection lab of any sort. Are you familiar with like what types of software or what those schools use for their virtual learning?
I am not familiar with that at this time, but I'm sure we will start looking into that as we are writing our manuscript. But right now, like the schools who are purely just the virtual gross anatomy labs, I'm not sure what software they use.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought that might be an interesting talking point, maybe like in the discussion to talk about, yeah, what other schools, if there's other studies that have looked at what's been successful for virtual learning at other institutions. Yeah.
Dr. Dennis, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll comment on it. I think Glenn's, Kara, and Brian's comments. Great job, Alyssa. But I think when you think about using the virtual dissector in populations of students that from the get-go are applying to schools that full well know they're never going to have the opportunity to work in a cadaver lab, and maybe they're searching that out because of their own personal preference of avoidance of that, you would automatically be biasing the population the other way. And so it's hard to compare curricula like that simply because you're introducing from the get-go the student bias and perception that you are or are not going to be using cadavers, and therefore the students are already buying into that particular curriculum, most likely based on the fact that they just wanted to get into medical school, right? So that contributes to it to some extent as well. I will say more specifically to Brian's question, virtual human dissector is one of the top dissection-based virtual programs that most medical schools, if they are virtual, a lot of them do use it. And so there is a feature to go in, depending on what type of license you buy, that you can actually utilize some of the dissection modules that are built by other universities. But obviously, one drawback of that is that it really needs to mirror whatever you are also doing in your own curriculum at your particular medical school. So it is very, very widely used, which is part of the reason why it became one of the top ones that we were looking at, for sure.
Dr. Zolniers, go ahead.
So kind of to pick up on something that Dr. Dennis touched upon about biases, do you think with the tutors having, and possibly fellows too, this kind of negative feeling about the software and using the software, do you think that might have led to biases within the first year students and them thinking then that the software is not good and they're not getting a good education based on kind of how they see the tutors and fellows interacting with it?
Oh, absolutely. I think I know of several tutors who didn't necessarily talk down about the software, but just continued to say things like, oh, well, you know, this is the best I can give you, or it was much different and better my year. And so I think things that the tutors and the fellows maybe said to their students would absolutely influence how the students were feeling about that software and potentially sway, you know, their responses and their willingness to even try it out.
Student Dr. Schiller, I think you raised your hand again.
Yes, and I apologize. This is less a question for student Dr. Kendell and more out of curiosity for those in administration in the chat. If you compare kind of costs to the fullest license of VEH dissector or any of these other dissectors to the cost of, well, the full licensure for both campuses to the costs of running the cadaver labs of both campuses, is it a for sure saving to do the full licensure of the virtual?
I know a ballpark estimate of each, and it's definitely a savings to do the virtual. Even if it's not a direct one-to-one on the cost of cadavers compared to the software, if you even add in the faculty time dedicated to the lab, that in and of itself would be a cost savings.
Okay, any more questions out there?
I did have a quick question. So I have noticed at KCU that we have like, I think they're called anatomage tables, but they're like fully virtual tables where the image of the cadaver is projected onto the screen. So it's like this huge screen basically, and you're just looking over it like you would a real cadaver. And I know that at one point we had one in AC 100. I have never seen it being used at all. I was just wondering if maybe that is used for other activities here on campus. And was it ever considered that that could be potentially a better virtual option during the time of the pandemic?
I'm not sure about when or how often that's used, but just the fact that it is something that you would have to come to campus and use was probably not a viable option for the height of the pandemic. But I personally have never used it, and I don't even know where that table is stored on campus. So I'm not sure. Maybe Dr. Dennis could answer that.
It's currently it's been moved over to the CMEI. And so they're primarily using it for interactive activities with public education, basically. I would say one of the limiting things is, as Alyssa referenced, in the pandemic, it really wasn't a viable option. You have to be interacting with it at its face surface. Additionally, there's no anatomage table in Joplin, so we could not, even if it was a possibility during the pandemic, we couldn't utilize it in a way that would be equivalent across both campuses for curricular purposes.
Thank you so much, student Dr. Kendell. Appreciate you. We'll process the video and let you know when it's done and ready to go, okay?
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Have a good weekend. Great job, Alyssa.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye.